love the chase and the hunt, and I set the pace when I'm running. I always take what I want and I always give it 100. Don't need a bank, no I'm funded. Play the game like it's nothing. I'm always thankful for something. Don't take for granted, stay humble. Now wake up, it's time to look at the enemy.
Hello everyone. Hello Pedro, how are you doing?
I'm doing fine as usual. How are you?
As usual. Okay, that's really good. Yeah, same here. Now I'm very excited. We're just talking that we have a really cool guest today. We can't wait to dive into a topic of today's conversation. So today we're gonna have with us Philip Su, and his story, we found it super fascinating, and I hope you guys are gonna find it super interesting too. He is a former Microsoft engineer. He was a second employee at Facebook's Seattle office, and then he became a lead at their London office. He at one point of his life decided to work at the peak season at the Amazon flagship warehouse in Seattle, and then recorded a podcast where he talks about his story and about how the work in the warehouse was. The podcast name is Peak Salvation. We had a listen through it. Very cool. His storytelling is really amazing, and he tells it in a very engaging way, very worth checking out. That was a very short introduction, but it's intentional because I want Philip to introduce himself and tell us more about him. Hello, Philip.
Great. Hello. So it's so great to be here. Thank you for having me. I've just been so excited to talk about this experience because I've spent most of my time in technology, working on the software that eventually will replace people, in places like warehouses and whatnot. And for me to work in a warehouse was a really humbling and helpful experience just to see what it's like to really work in one of these places. With Amazon becoming America's largest employer this year, it's really important to think about what it feels like for 1 million employees to work at Amazon. 1 out of every 153 people in America that are work in an Amazon warehouse. So it was pretty amazing for me to join that experience.
True. I have a first question. I've listened to your podcast, most of it, your podcast called Peak Salvation. I was wondering, after such an experience, why did you decide to do a podcast and not a book, for instance? Or is there any reason behind? Because that is material for a book, right?
Yeah, great question. I didn't realize how long it would be, actually. It's about 80,000 words or so. And I didn't realize that when writing it, because what happened is after the first few days of working there, I thought I should take some notes on this experience because I wanted it more as a journal for myself to remember a certain period of my life and a certain feeling that I had. And so I started to take notes. And as things happened, as you know from the podcast, like truth is stranger than fiction, the weirdest things happen and the most interesting things happen to me. And so it ended up being a lot fuller than I expected. But this whole time, making the podcast for me was a lot more about a personal diary of sorts than it really was to make a bigger production out of it. But in the end, I was glad to have so much content.
Yeah, it makes sense. Yeah, because I was listening to it and I was saying, well, if you wrote a book, that would be interesting, to be honest.
Yeah, I think you have a really engaging way of telling a story, and also the way you were telling it was super cool, and we could almost feel like we were there with you. But what is the feedback that you got from people that listen to the podcast?
Yeah, great question. I have a lot of people who wanted to discuss things like my view on automation replacing people, because that is heavily debated, in the tech circles, whether or not robots really will replace all of us, or whether I'm being a Luddite when I say that, And so there were a lot of sort of those discussions, but I think one of the most meaningful sort of exchanges I got as a result of the podcast was a woman who worked in a Whole Foods warehouse. Whole Foods is now owned by Amazon. She wrote in, and it was really neat to discuss her story. Having graduated with a college degree from American universities for graphic design, she found herself suddenly working the next 3 years in a Whole Foods warehouse. And now it's hard to dig out of that. You get into a state where you don't make enough income to quite save enough, but you also have no time to actually search for a job because, as you know, you can easily get fired fired from Amazon for missing shifts and whatnot. And so it ends up being that she finds herself graduated 3 years later, still working in a Whole Foods warehouse. And it was just really humbling to have that discussion with her, where she was saying it's understandably hard for someone in her position to listen to a podcast where someone like me, who doesn't have to work for a living, is in a sense sort of temporarily working in a warehouse to get that experience. And so it was a neat discussion with her just to realize how much for Americans it's even about college grads unable to find jobs that lands people in these warehouses.
And talking about that, like, what made you decide to apply for this job in the first place? Why such a change? Because you were and you are a successful engineer working for the big companies, and you are even a millionaire, like, or you earn a lot of money. What made you decide to apply for this?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think I had maybe 2 or 3 main reasons that I wanted a job at Amazon. First is I've just been a customer for so long. In 2021, I think I placed a total of almost 200 orders from Amazon. So I'm like a rabid sort of fan of Amazon. But at the same time, another reason is I was honestly a little bit skeptical when I read in the American media about how dramatically bad the job situation in Amazon is. You'll read these stories in American newspapers where people will say, people had to pee in bottles, some of the drivers. And then you'll read stories like some lady was left near dead on the warehouse floor as people were asked to work around her body, So you'll read stories like this. And I sort of felt like, well, I'm sure that happened in the sense that if you have 1 million workers, of course, anything that could happen probably has happened. But at the same time, how could that possibly be America's #1 volume employer if the job was really that bad, right? Right now in America, there are 2 open jobs for every 1 job seeker. So it raises the question, why do people choose to work at an Amazon warehouse if it truly is that disastrous, right? And so I went in with a little bit of skepticism, honestly, toward the media in what it had said about Amazon. So I wanted to experience it for myself. And the third reason is I had been unemployed for about 8 months at this point. I stepped down from my previous job leading a Seattle nonprofit because I was really dealing with depression very poorly. I was really struggling with getting the activation energy to do work and to handle the stress of work. And so I had stepped back from that and sort of quit that job. But I found myself after months, sitting at home expecting to feel a lot better because I blamed my depression on my work stress. And I found myself, 8 months in, still feeling very low. And what I needed from Amazon was really the sort of schedule and the discipline around work. And what I loved about it was not only did you have to go in every day at 6:30 in the morning or else you're fired, during the day, what I loved about that job versus all of my other jobs is you don't have to make any decisions. You arrive and people who don't know your name tell you what to do. You just show up and they point at you and they tell you to go do that. And you just go do that, And for me, for the longest time, when I ran Facebook's London office, it was 600 engineers, And so I was very used to sort of big decisions and hard decisions and people relying on me and me being responsible for things. I loved showing up in a place where no one knew my name and they would literally tell me what to do. And it was never my responsibility to decide what would happen next. And so that was a thing I was looking for in the job to help me out of my depression.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think we can both relate, right, Marta? Because we are somehow related to IT world also.
Yeah, not the warehouse environment at all, but the IT world on a smaller scale.
World, when I was younger, I was working in a warehouse also, and I can relate to what you're saying. Like you are told what you have to do, and that's quite different. But I have another question. What if your wife thought about the whole idea when you told her?
Yeah, I at first was a little hesitant to tell her because it sounds like the type of thing where people would question your sanity, of course, like you do all these big jobs, like you make a lot of money and then you sit at home and then you start sleeping too much. And then one day you announce you're working at an Amazon warehouse. So I was a little bit worried about that at first, but my wife, I'm really appreciative of her because she was just so empathetic toward what she knew was a very deep depression for me, and so
Mm.
I explained to her that I was primarily looking for something that would force me to get out of bed every day and to, coupled with physical exercise. Actually, the warehouse is a ton of exercise. And,
True.
the classic thing for depressives, they say, is the three things is eat well, sleep well, and then exercise,
Yeah.
right? And I figured that
Mm-hmm.
Amazon would cover 2 out of 3 there. So she was very empathetic about it and she understood right away. And I'm really appreciative because, honestly, many people would be slightly ashamed, I think, to have a spouse who used to do big jobs, who now you have to say works at an Amazon warehouse. That for many
Mm-hmm.
people sounds like an embarrassing thing. And it really wasn't for her at all. So I'm really grateful for all her support.
Yeah, it just shows your wife is really understanding, and obviously she knew what you needed. Yeah, because you're
Right.
right. Like the first thought that anyone can have is like, "Wow, what's such a big change?" Right? But
Right.
makes sense.
Yeah, I actually wonder, since we are kind of talking about the opinion of people that you might be making like a massive change and it's a bit insane and stuff, but was it hard for you at this stage to kind of put aside the comforts you had in previous jobs and put yourself out of the comfort zone and having crazy hours and then work physically a lot? Like, was it more scary, or were you like excited for this change and kind of see how it's going to evolve?
Yeah, I was mostly excited primarily because the months before this, I was just laying around the house, really depressed, like doing very little. The thing is, when you first quit work, the first few weeks are amazing. It's just like going on vacation. So the
Mhm.
first few weeks you quit, it's like, yes, no responsibilities. I'll go skiing on the daytimes or I'll go, shopping when no one's there, right?
Mm.
So it
Mm.
sounds exciting at first, but I think what many people who've never taken a longer pause from work might not realize is that there's a certain loneliness with being the only person not working. You reach
Yeah.
out
Mm.
to your friends to grab a coffee, but they're all working. And then
Yes.
on the weekend, since they've deferred everything else to the weekend, they're busy on the weekend with all their family things. And so it
Mm.
ends up being, in a way, kind of isolating to be on your own.
True.
And so for me, just hanging about at home, I was looking forward to a change, and I was genuinely so curious about what the job would be like. The last time I held an hourly paid job was in college, and so
Mhm.
Mm.
it was 20 some years since I did. And so I was looking forward to learning from the inside what things are like since I order so much from Amazon. And I also think just the change in pace was something I was very much looking forward to. But
Mm.
to your other question, Marta, I think the benefits are radically different. When I worked at Facebook, it was 3 meals a day, catered, amazing food like steak you would have for lunch, just
Mhm.
ridiculous, right? Sometimes free massages and ping pong tables. And the whole thing's like a big playground, right? And when
Mhm.
you show up at Amazon, they give you a little welcome bag of gifts. And inside it is like an ice pack and like one sports drink and a COVID mask. And that's what you get on your
That's
first day,
very
right?
fancy.
So it was so radically different. Even small things like this sounds dumb, but paying for your own soda, like going to the
Mm.
Mhm.
canteen and like you got to pay for everything, right? This idea that it's not just a buffet all the time, it's radically different. But I'll tell you what else I felt is I've always felt a little bit working in technology that we've become spoiled.
Yeah.
I
True.
Mhm.
often used to joke with people who worked. So for the first 6 months at Facebook Seattle, I was the oldest person in the office. And back then I was 36. So if you can
Whoa.
imagine my entire time working at Amazon, my entire reporting chain from me all the way up to Mark Zuckerberg, everybody above me was younger than me for my entire time.
Whoa.
Right.
That's
And so
insane.
like for me to be the quote unquote oldest, I used to tell older people in the office, I used to joke with them that, hey, if a person's first job out of college is Facebook, they are going to be ruined for the rest of their life. Like it's just the only way is down, from there. And it reminds me of a huge incident in Microsoft about 15 years ago where due to budget issues, they decided to stop stocking clean towels in the locker rooms for the people who bike in, right?
And they
And this
complained.
towels thing became such a huge debate within the company. Like people were threatening, to quit, or like most Americans,
Jesus
threatening
Christ.
to move to Canada when the wrong person gets into
No.
office. Like the whole thing happened where like this email chain blew up, all these complaints about towels. And I remember back then thinking, wow, you can complain this much about a free clean towel service at your workplace. Like that just sounds ridiculous to me, right? And so part of me always felt like big tech had gotten to an unhealthy level where work was too mixed in with these creature comforts instead of people getting enjoyment out of the work itself, because work really can be pleasurable. This idea of mastery and autonomy and this idea of decision making and impacting customers in a positive way, that can be very energizing. But you can get confused by all the creature comforts and think that work is primarily good because of all these comforts. And so this is one thing where working at Amazon really helped me appreciate that on one hand, it treats its warehouse workers on a very low budget, and so like the big prize was they had a big drawing for amongst the 3,000 workers that worked with me in the warehouse. They had a big drawing for a $25 gift certificate. And I felt like, wow, at Facebook, you could blow $25 eating free food for lunch, but that was the big prize, And so going down to that level was so helpful because then you start looking at what other things in the job you really can appreciate. And there were things in the warehouse where when you get into the zone and you start feeling a sense of flow in doing the work, it is actually pleasurable in a way. And maybe that's too extreme of a word to use, but have you ever, I don't know, like during the middle of washing the dishes, let's say, right? Have you ever felt that sense of like your mind can sort of wander and think about other things because your body is like gently doing something physical,
Totally.
but not too taxing and not too complicated? Like
Yeah.
that feeling, you get the same feeling when you're packaging. I was processing maybe 300 packages an hour, right? And you get into the zone where you're just like, oh, this one goes to Atlanta. Oh, this one goes to Las Vegas. And you just get into the zone where you're just moving boxes and your mind is free to think about whatever you want. It's almost in a way meditative, to repeat the same motions over and over and just to be amongst yourself in your head. And so I enjoyed those aspects. And I think overall, the great trimming of benefits was for me a huge reset of the hedonic treadmill. Just
So
becoming
basically,
much more appreciative of what it means to have every little thing. So whereas
yeah.
Facebook gave me free steak for lunch, my biggest prize during this whole entire peak season was that they were giving away free Costco pies, like pumpkin pies from Costco. And they were still labeled $5.99, per pie. And I was so thankful for that pie. Like it tasted delicious. And the reason is, $5.99 is like something like 24 minutes of work, you know what I mean? And so like you really start to realize, wow, 24 minutes of work, that's me moving about 170 packages, is what this pie, cost. And so you get really grateful for all sorts of things. And I think it's really helpful, at least in my own life, to have that huge reset of expectations.
Yeah. So I would say after this experience, it sounds like you have reframed your mind a little bit. So maybe you don't feel that upper middle class so much now or something like that, or...
Absolutely. Like, I've always had this thing in my mind where I've compared things I bought to the number of hours I need to work. And I know that sounds obsessive and crazy, but I think it started with me working at Subway for below minimum wage, for $3 an hour. And back then, the Big Mac meal at McDonald's was $2.99. So I always thought of my job as like earning a Big Mac meal every hour, right? And so since that time, I've always thought that way. And so when I worked at the Amazon warehouse for $18.55 an hour, Now, when I go out and I buy like dinner for the family and it's like $60, I think, whoa, like $60 is
Mhm.
a lot of money going out the door for this meal, you know. The other day in America, the prices have gone nuts. In America, I bought 1/4 pounder with cheese from McDonald's, 1/4 pounder with cheese meal, you know, and I was too cheap to
Mhm.
buy meals for the rest of the family. So I just bought 3 sandwiches without the meals. So total
Mhm.
4 sandwiches, one meal, right? Came
Mhm.
out the door of McDonald's for $31. And so things have just gone completely berserk
Yeah.
here. And so for me to realize that McDonald's meal for the family was an hour and a half of work, the whole
Mhm.
thing does, like you say, Pedro, just reframe the whole
Yeah.
issue of how we spend and how much we really need to live on.
I see. It's
That,
interesting. Yeah.
that's very true, especially how you're telling us about when you actually think how much work you have to put and how much work has to people have to put, like physical work, even as you said, like moving packages and how much you can buy for it. Like it gives you a different perspective of the value of your work and money. We are also wondering, because you were inside, sort of, you have the insight into how things are packed, and what we usually see is that we order something on Amazon and then it gets delivered. But can you actually summarize to us what is the process? So what happens when I buy the item until I deliver it, until I get it delivered? Yeah.
Yeah, great questions. So the warehouse itself has almost 3 or 4 big stages to it. And so what happens is first, these huge trucks come into the part they call inbound ship dock. And that is trucks from manufacturers. So you should think of, trucks full of diapers or trucks full of cups or whatever else. And what happens in inbound ship dock is those things are offloaded from the trucks onto pallets. These huge pallets, maybe 6 feet high, 5 to 6 feet high, maybe 4 or 5 feet wide. And so full of boxes. And those boxes from manufacturers go to a place where people unpack them and basically load them into those robotized Amazon shelves. You might have seen them online, where like a little robot drives a shelf maybe about 7 feet high,
Mhm.
full of bins, yellow bins in which different products are placed, right? And so there are people who unpack the boxes and put them into those bins. And then there are people they call pickers, who are standing on elevated platforms overlooking the robots. And what happens
Mhm.
with pickers is they pick whatever the robots take to their station. So the robots are basically automated to know the most efficient way to pick products out for a certain customer. And so these robots will roll up, these robotic shelves will roll up to pickers, and they're told to, pick an item from B4. And so they take an
Mhm.
item from B4 and they click a green button. That means they've gotten the item. And so that's their job the entire day. A picker is rated at, I think you have to pick slightly more than one item per 6.5 seconds or so to keep your
Oh.
job, basically. So
Mhm.
throughout the 11 hours, it's an item every 6 or 7 seconds, right? So you're picking these things out the whole day. And then what happens with those things is the pickers fill these little bins with things targeted toward one customer, and they go down a conveyor belt to the packers. And the packers are the ones who take cardboard boxes and unfold them and tape the bottom side. So flip it to the top side, put the gray bin items in, and then they pack and label the boxes. And once that happens, those boxes go on a conveyor where they go toward outbound ship dock, which is where I worked. So in outbound ship dock, everything that comes into outbound ship dock is already a fully sealed package labeled, destined for a customer. And in
Mhm.
outbound ship dock, the logistics is just sorting the packages so that they go into the right trucks again. So if you think of the warehouse as like a giant breathing beast, right? It breathes in boxes from manufacturers,
Mhm.
resifts everything into a different order, and breathes out boxes to customers.
Mm.
That's basically the pace of the warehouse.
Yeah, it's a perfect explanation to me. Before this interview, like Amazon warehouse seemed to me like Willy Wonka factory or something like that. Now I understand much better. But in which area were you working? You were in Sheepdog, maybe, or
Yeah, I was in outbound ship dock the whole time.
okay.
And what's crazy is you don't get to choose where you work. And so this is the funny
Mm.
part. In outbound ship dock, you can lift packages up to maybe 50 pounds. And so what happens is, even I worked alongside people who looked to me like they were 68 years old, and kind of a frail man that I kept trying to help there also. He could obviously not lift all the boxes. And I have no idea why they don't assign people who can't lift the boxes to jobs like picker, because in the picker job, you're only picking a single Amazon item out at any time, right? Whereas in outbound ship dock, you're dealing with packages with multiple items in them. So it's obviously heavier. But I don't know how they do the assignments. So when I applied for a job, they didn't once ask where I wanted to work, didn't give me a choice. I just
That's
showed up
weird.
on the first day and they said, okay, you're outbound ship dock. And so there I went.
So they assume
You're
everyone
like,
can work
okay.
in Europe.
Yeah,
Like,
basically there are no choices. Now, here's the other funny thing is once you're in the job for a few months, you can apply to transfer, right? And so people often want to transfer from night shift to day shift, for instance. They want to transfer from a weekend shift to what's called donut, which is Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday. It's like a donut with a hole on Wednesday, basically. So I got randomly assigned the daytime donut shift in outbound ship dock, which apparently is one of the most attractive jobs for people in the warehouse. And I have no idea why I was assigned that job instead of giving right of first refusal to all the other people who already work there that want to switch into that job. And if you were a cynic, what you would say is it's probably deliberate. They put new people in there instead of swapping existing people. Because think about this. If you managed the warehouse and all you cared about was cost, right? If you have a picker that wants to go to outbound ship dock, you have to train that picker to do outbound ship dock work, and you have to train a new worker to do the picker's job, right? But if you just hire a new person into outbound ship dock, you only have to front the training cost one time. And so like a cynic might say that they give outside people a first shot at these jobs instead of inside transfers because it's more efficient from a job training perspective.
But the turnover rate there is quite short, right? As I understand, like...
Yeah, when I worked at Amazon, the annual turnover was 150%. So the average worker stays there 8 months.
Jesus Christ. So basically Amazon doesn't want people to work long there, right?
Yeah, and Jeff Bezos himself has explicitly said that. He has said that warehouse jobs should not be considered career roles. He expected people to very much go in, work a while, and then leave. But you know what's crazy is now that 1 in every 153 working Americans works in an Amazon warehouse, they cannot afford to keep churning these people over, right? If at those levels, you literally every year you churn through 1.5 people, you're going to run out of American workers pretty soon. So my guess is in the next year or two, they are going to have to radically change their philosophy, either toward mass robotization, right, which will solve the problem, or some sort of much better benefits or retention so that people don't just quit all the time.
I see robotization coming then.
Yeah, the robots are coming for sure.
Yeah.
But when you were, I'm kind of trying to paint a picture of the warehouse and the work there. Like, how would you describe like a regular day? When you would come in the morning, what would you do? And then throughout the day, and how would you end?
Yeah, great question. So every day began at 6:30 a.m. So I worked the daytime shift, which during peak season is 11 hours. And then you have half an hour of unpaid time, mandatory, required by our government for lunch, basically. So I show up at 6:30 in the morning, and you can show up only 5 minutes before or 5 minutes after 6:30, or else bad things happen. So I would show up right on time, scan your badge in because they had these time card machines, right? And then walk about 2 minutes to the back of the warehouse to the ship dock. And every day in ship dock, there was basically a morning stand-up meeting where maybe 60 people in ship dock would stand around in a circle as the manager talked about what would happen that morning. And so they would typically tell you the expected volume. So they'll say something like 13,000 in Q1 and 26,000 in Q2. They divide the day into 4 quarters like the year, right? And so what happens is Q1 is your period before first break. Q2 is your period before lunch, Q3 is the period before second break, and Q4 is the last period before you leave work. And so they'd give you a sense of volume. There's required mandatory calisthenics in the morning to stretch and to like stretch your ankles and things. And I'm pretty sure this is to reduce, lawsuits. And so like you have to twist your wrist and you got to stretch your arms. And so the manager leads you in that. And then basically you pick up a scanner, you go to a huge whiteboard with everybody's little name tags stuck on it with magnets in different locations, and you find your own name tag because your name tag will be put in the category that you're supposed to work that day. So in outbound ship dock, there are many different jobs. There are people who sort the flat packages, the little bubble wrap packages. There are people who sort the big finished packages. There are people who move the carts from loaded carts into the trucks. So there are all sorts of jobs. And so you go up to the board to find your job. You flip your name tag from upside down to right side up, which lets them do what they call, quote unquote, labor track. And so I'm sure they're checking whether people are showing up. And then you basically go to your assigned area. And when you show up at the assigned area, you do that work. Someone could come up to you in half an hour and tell you to go somewhere else, in which case you go somewhere else. Or if no one talks to you for the whole day, you work in that assigned area 11 hours and then you go home. So basically that's the structure of the day with 2 15-minute breaks and then 1 30-minute lunch in the middle of the day.
Mm-hmm. And how was your first day? Do you experience any type of hazing or prank or?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I thought at first that their little gift bag to me, the gallon-sized Ziploc bag, I thought was a hazing prank because, when I worked at Facebook on the first day, they gave us a MacBook Pro and the latest iPhone and like a hoodie and like free food. And so on the first day I showed up at Amazon, the manager handed out these Ziploc gallon-sized bags, freezer bags, with the hot and cold compress, with one sachet of some sort of drink, with one painkiller pill, and then like a COVID mask. And when they first handed that to me, I really thought it was a joke. Like I thought, these people have such a good sense of humor. Like, oh, this is so funny. But no, they were dead serious. Like this was the one thing they gave you as a welcome gift,
Oh my God.
And I guarantee you there is no way that people who start in the corporate offices of Amazon get a gallon-sized Ziploc bag, of painkillers and things when they start work. And so you definitely feel treated very, very differently from the people who work in corporate. But there was no real sort of hazing or anything. There wasn't any sort of yelling at people or anything like that. They have just such a big machine of onboarding, right? Because if 150% of your staff turnover every year, just the new hire orientation and onboarding itself has to be a machine of sorts.
Yeah. Well, in that regard, that's interesting, right? Because if the turnover is that high, you are so performance oriented, like you have to, keep some certain rate depending on the area where you're working. Like, how is the interaction with the rest? Did you make any friends there?
Yeah, I think there were a few people that I was friendly with, but the most common friends you see is, I'll put it this way. When I ask people, why did you choose to work at Amazon? The number one reason is a relative of mine works here. And the number two reason was a friend of mine worked here. And so most people who you see talking to each other, they are either relatives or they are friends coming from within. It's actually a little tricky to make friends otherwise. And I think there are a few reasons for it. One is everybody is working different shifts. And so let's say on Monday you go in and you meet a person and you're working well with him, right? What happens is that person might be working a different shift from you. And so they'll probably not be there Tuesday. Plus, if they're there on Tuesday, remember that you're randomly assigned to jobs, right? And so the odds of you being assigned to a related area are very low from day to day. And so your run-ins with the same people over time are actually fairly low. And I think the third thing is the work itself. It's quite noisy in the warehouse. There are machines going all the time. You're lifting boxes. You're being rated on how often you're moving the boxes, right? And so there's not a lot of chance for collaboration. I think one of the jobs where you meet the least people is probably either the picker or the packer, because the pickers and the packers, they have their own stations. And so they aren't even within reasonable earshot of anybody else. So within your station, you're just working and the robots are coming and they're coming and they're coming, and you're too far from anybody else to even have a conversation. So I do think that meeting people there, getting to know them is actually fairly rare. And I also think that in a way, if you've ever lived in the heart of a city, there's a way in which people avoid eye contact in general because they don't want to stir up trouble, so there's like people pay attention to their own thing, because in the warehouse, like, you have a variety of people. Like, one day I was going into work, and one man, as he walked by this poster board with photos of all the managers in the warehouse, he literally turned to one of the photos and just yelled directly into the photo, like really loudly for a long time, and then just turned and kept walking toward his workstation. And so
Oh,
you
wow.
run into things like that and you're like, well, I'm not sure I want to talk to everybody here. And so there's just a very broad palette of people. And I think like in most inner cities, people tend to mind their own business. They don't want to stir up trouble or anything. But over time, of course, if you work with a few people, a few people were quite friendly with me, and I thought they were very nice. So I would get to know them and learn where they were from. Met a man from Laos, met a person who was working her way through college and using it to pay. So you do meet people, but I think there just aren't many chances to socialize at all.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah, I think it's probably quite tricky. And as you said, when people kind of quit their job after a few months, it's also probably a bit hard to build like long-lasting friendships through that. You mentioned a bit of this urban legends about Amazon being like a horrible place that people can't have breaks and stuff. There's one urban legend about people not having time to pee at all. Like, is that true, or that's an urban legend? And actually, you can like you mentioned breaks, but can you go in the middle of your shift to take a break, go to the bathroom, or you're not allowed and you just have to work?
Yeah, great question. I was personally very curious about this because I was obsessed with this idea of whether I would pee on myself, and I had read a lot of press reports about that. So I was very curious about the whole bathroom thing. I can only speak to the specific warehouse I worked in, BFI 4, and I worked during peak season. So it was the busiest time by far, right? But I found bathroom breaks never to be a problem. I mean, there are two reasons. One is you have 3 breaks in the day, right? And there were never lines out the doors or anything like that. But the second thing is you are allowed to go to the bathroom whenever you want to. Now, the asterisk on that is you just have to make sure you don't fall behind in your pace. You know what I mean? So like, let's say you're a picker and you're expected to pick an item about every 6 seconds, right? If you go to the bathroom for a minute, you're just going to have to be able to pick 10 items faster, within the next 5 minutes to get yourself caught back up, right? And so there is a way in which, like in the jobs, you do have to watch your metrics a little bit carefully, but I never found that to be a problem. In outbound ship dock, for instance, the expected rate of a good outbound ship dock worker might be 180 packages an hour, right? And I was easily doing 220. My peak packages was 380, and so if I wanted to take a break to go to the bathroom, I totally could. Now, when you think about the bathroom, however, the thing to realize is the warehouse is 1/3 of a mile long. So it is a
Wow.
very large building. So just to walk to the bathroom, you're not allowed to run because it's a warehouse, safety, blah, blah, blah. So just to walk to the bathroom can take 2 minutes, can literally
big
take
is
2
the
minutes.
building?
So you do have to think about that a little carefully. So I think most people plan their bathroom breaks around the lunch break or the 2 breaks in the day. I never personally found it to be a problem and was honestly a little bit disappointed because I do think that was one of the more salacious things that you would read on the internet that sounds like, whoa, that sounds terrible. If everybody's peeing on themselves, how does this work, right? But it goes back to my point that in America right now, there are 2 open jobs for every 1 job seeker. And so people really do have choice right now in what they do. And people pick the Amazon job for its own reasons. It really is not as bad as it sounds. It is a job where I think there needs to be regulation because they really do not treat workers very well in several major ways. So I'm not at all defending the job, but all I mean is if it was a job where half the people were peeing on themselves every day, there are plenty of other jobs in America to take.
That's very true. I just had a horrible thought because if you pee on yourself, I guess it gets quite slippery. So that's against health and safety regulations in the warehouse again.
Yes, totally. Not allowed.
That's not allowed. Not allowed. You have to keep it for as long as you can. You mentioned that you were quite efficient in your work, but we also heard from your podcast that you got a bit of an injury through like handling all these packages. Can you tell us a little bit more and then how this was treated when you were working there?
Yeah, so I ended up getting tendonitis. So what happens is you use in outbound ship dock, you use your fingers a whole lot because you know how Amazon has a bunch of packages that are maybe 2 or 3 inches thick. They're like small boxes basically. So the easiest way to handle those packages is you just clamp them with one hand as you use your scanner in the other hand to scan the label, right? And so I got very used to sort of clamping packages, and you kind of toss them after you clamp of them. But if you're moving hundreds of packages an hour, it can really strain the hands. And so what started happening to me is every morning for the first 30 minutes after waking up, my hands would be numb. And I hadn't felt that feeling before. But the other thing is my fingers would just be slightly curled throughout the day, not dramatically, but ever so slightly curled. And it would take the other hand sort of forcing the fingers straight for them to straighten out. And so after this went on for a few weeks, I thought, maybe this isn't a good thing because I am a computer scientist. So most of my life, I'm going to need to be able to type on a keyboard. And I was a little bit concerned that maybe I was damaging my fingers. So I went and told the Amazon HR people, and they said, you should get this checked out by a doctor, blah, blah, blah. So after work one day, I went and got it checked, and they said, yeah, this is tendonitis. They gave me like a steroid sort of thing to reduce the inflammation. And then they gave me basically a thing that said I should lift 10 pounds or less per package for at least 2 weeks, right? So they gave me like a disposition to have a lighter duty job. Now, that's when things got really funny because I ended up having to follow the Amazon HR process for filing for what they call a medical accommodation. And the kicker is I filed for it immediately and they said, okay, well, it'll take about 7 days for us to get back to you, right? And after 7 days had passed, I wrote them back again saying, hey, what's happening? And they said, oh, yeah, okay, well, we approve your medical accommodation. You can work on light duty, but it's 2 to 3 hours a day. And it's on a completely different shift. So they wanted me to work Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday.
Oh, no.
And my only choices to this medical accommodation was either to say, yes, I will change my shifts and change my hours, or no, never mind, my body is fine. They want you to sign a thing that basically says, never mind, I'm going back to work, right?
I was just kidding.
Yeah, but the kicker is this, right? Like at first I felt like 2 or 3 hours a day. This is so sweet. I'm going to love it on light duty, right? But then I thought, oh, no, wait, like 2 or 3 hours a day means they're cutting your pay, right? At a time when in the warehouse, you're working 11 hours with 3 of those hours being overtime, right? At a time when you are working overtime hours, you are getting paid a good deal of money. And so for them to give me 3 hours a day, when you do the math across 2 weeks, that would have been about 60% of my salary for the month, would have gone to taking this accommodation. Like I would be literally paid less by maybe $1,800 for the month when the total month I would have made $2,600, And so for the average person to sign that sheet of paper and say, yeah, great, put me on the accommodation, that takes a person who's willing to forsake maybe about 60% of that month's salary. So if you think about what that really does, it's absolutely ridiculous, right? And the other thing is they gratuitously moved my shift. When I showed up for light duty, which is like you click on a mouse on these computers, I was the only person and 7 other workstations were completely free. So it wasn't even like, the workstations were full. They had to work me to a different shift. They just gratuitously changed me to a weekend shift. And so if you think about like, if I was working the donut shift and I had any childcare needs, right? Maybe I take care of my own kids on the weekends. For me to suddenly go on accommodation where I have to find childcare for the weekend, it's just absolutely nuts, right? So I think the accommodation system is really designed in a way that makes it very hard for you to accept the accommodation. You have to be willing to forsake all that pay and work a completely different shift. So you have to manage your childcare and everything separately. But I showed up for medical accommodation after back and forth with them on which day do I start, blah, blah, blah. And what was so funny is after all of the paperwork from the Amazon side literally took 13 out of the 14 days I was on medical accommodation. So I showed up for 1 day of the medical accommodation, and that was my last day that the doctor's note had permitted. So I basically did 1 day of light duty, and then it was back to normal work.
That's interesting. I mean, what about extra hours in there? Did you have to do extra hours, and did they notify you in advance, or how did that work?
Yeah. So during peak season, which in America runs between Thanksgiving and Christmas, so for about those 6 weeks, peak season has mandatory overtime, mandatory extra time at Amazon for every employee. So first is between Thanksgiving and Christmas, no employee vacations are allowed. So those are all out. So I worked on Thanksgiving, for instance, and I worked on Christmas Eve, right? But the other thing is the mandatory hours goes normally from a 40-hour work week to a 55-hour work week. to a 50 or a 55-hour work week. And that's mandatory. So every day your shift is 11 hours. And so with lunch, 30 minutes, that's 11 and a half. And so I typically left home every morning at 5:45 in the morning, and I got home every evening at about 7:30. So you have about 2 hours at home, 2 to 3 hours at home before you have to go to sleep. But the mandatory overtime is not only 11 hours a day, but if you miss any one shift, you're fired, basically. And so the rules are really strict around this. And the last thing that was very tough is they could tell you as little as 18 hours in advance that you had a mandatory overtime day tomorrow. So for instance, Friday at noon, they can tell you tomorrow, Saturday, you need to come in for 11 hours or else you're fired. Right. And what's so crazy with that system is think about if you were taking care of an elderly parent or you had children, right? And I were to tell you the day before you have to find 11 hours of care for tomorrow or else you're fired. It is absolutely nuts. And you have to remember that in America, health care for your family is tied to employment. So being fired is not just about you losing your $2,800 a month. It's about your entire family losing health care. It's a very big deal to get fired in America, right? And so this whole idea that they can add mandatory overtime just a day in advance also even made it for me. You know, I don't need childcare for my kids, but you know what's so crazy is I couldn't make plans with friends on the weekend because I couldn't guarantee that I could be there. You know, like the only time I could be sure I could do something with you on Saturday was Friday afternoon. I could say, okay, Saturday is clear. We can do something, right? And so I don't know how people plan their lives around this. I know one of the big things that the unions that have formed at Amazon, so there have been 1 or 2 warehouses, I think, that have successfully unionized. One of the main things the union is asking for is actually more reasonable, predictable schedules, you know, like more protections around how many days in advance can you be notified of mandatory overtime. Things like, can you add mandatory overtime at a time like a weekend when a person normally doesn't work? You know, these sorts of worker protections that have nothing to do with pay that are still, I think, an essential part of the comfort of working in a job.
So, would you do it again? And what was your best and your worst moment in there?
Yeah, great questions. I think, you know, I honestly would do it again. I think for me, though, some of it in doing it again, I would most like to be assigned to a different role, because I'm very curious about how each of the roles work. And when you work in the warehouse for just peak season, you don't get to switch roles. So I'd love to work with the robots, you know, as a picker, or work as a packer with the boxes and the tape and everything to learn a new role. And I also think that the mandatory schedule for me and the mindlessness of the job, you know, was really helpful. But it's not a role that I would seek out, you know, obviously, or hopefully obviously, is like, it is a hard job, you know, it is a hard job. And I think a job without friends and a job where people point at you and tell you to do things and they don't even learn your name. You know, my entire 6 weeks there, I never once met my manager at Amazon. I nominally had a manager. I could see her photo in my little employee app. You know, I could see the little org chart. And so I knew who my manager was, but she literally never met me, never bothered to meet me. And, you know, after working peak, I left without once having talked to her. So it is a lonely job. It is a job where they obviously don't care about you, right? And so I'm not at all saying that it's an attractive job. But I do think for the right people in the right circumstance, you know, for me in the depths of my depression, with my curiosity around peeing on myself as well as robots, it was a perfect job, you know, but I do think that it is not an enviable job in any sense of the word.
Yeah, actually, so talking about your like experience, and we were wondering, after you finished your work and you could do whatever you want again, and you didn't have to pack boxes, like, do you think that your mental health improved? Did you feel better after it? Like, was there anything that you learned from the experience that made you more grateful about like your daily life? Like, how did you feel after?
Yeah, it was hugely helpful, because I was very depressed and aimless, right? And during the job, it completely reset your expectations around just being grateful, not only for the Costco turkey, the Costco pumpkin pie, right? But things like, the warehouse every day when you get off work, about 800 cars need to drive out of the parking lot, right? And so you can sometimes wait in a line of cars for a long time. My record was waiting in the parking lot 22 minutes to get out, And
Whoa.
but here's the thing. The entire warehouse has no place to sit except the break rooms, right? The little step stools and everything, they each have custom stickers on it that say, do not sit, so they're obsessed with the idea that you don't sit in the warehouse, okay? So after 11 hours of not sitting in a car, air-conditioned car for 22 minutes going nowhere feels great. Like it feels like, oh, this is so great. I have air conditioning. I have a little radio music playing. I'm sitting in a soft seat, and so you really do reset your expectations to be a lot more grateful. I found myself for months afterwards, much more appreciative of everyday small things, as I joked with a friend, only half joked, he was telling me, over video, he was saying, hey, have a great day off tomorrow. And I was telling him, Wayne, every day off in this job is a great day off. Like, basically impossible to have a bad day off, and so it really did help me reset those expectations and feel a lot more grateful over time for everyday things.
So that's interesting. Like talking about depression, which is some kind of a taboo subject still, unfortunately. Like, would you say it is common in the IT world? And do you think it has to do more with the stress of the job or more with the fact that sometimes IT people are a little bit spoiled, and I include myself?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know because, I certainly know a lot of people struggling with mental health things, and I never want to, trivialize that. I found it very hard myself, but I do think that there's a way in which maybe it's not so much the stress of the job, but it's I don't know, like, how like
Patient.
games can be hard or easy. Like tic-tac-toe is no fun for anybody, right? Because that game is too
Yeah.
easy, right? But a game can be frustrating and hard as well in a way. Like if you join one of these online games and people are just killing you left and right, and you're like a newbie and you know nothing, like it can feel very depressing, right? And I wonder in a way whether tech jobs are, like you were saying, Pedro, maybe a little too comfortable in the sense that, if you get paid so much, right, and you complain whenever the steak stops at Facebook, or like you complain when towels aren't made, right, it's just so easy to then look at the rest of your life and be very Princess and the Pea sort of about it. Like the smallest things feel like, that's like discomforting or that's unsatisfying. I think the other thing for me, honestly, was having reached a point in my life where I technically don't have to work for income, I thought would be a very freeing and exhilarating feeling. And what I instead found is that you need a purpose and an aim. Like if you've ever seen these 60-year-olds who are like washing the car they saved up their whole life to buy, like the little red 67 Corvette or whatever. And every weekend they're out there washing. There's no need to wash it, but they're washing it and they love it and they love driving it slowly and talking to friends about it, right? That person only enjoys that car so much because he saved his entire life and finally got to buy the car. If that person was given that car by his parents when he was 23, there is no way that person is washing that car every weekend. Like that car will be mistreated because it's taken for granted, right? And I think similarly, this idea that we all have in our heads that if we only had $1 million, we could retire, never work again, it'll be brilliant, right? I think it's fabulous the first month. It really is amazing to not have to work for like a month. But after that, you start realizing that, work is not just making a paycheck. It is a chance for us to be useful to society. It's a chance for us to have coworkers and to feel part of a team. Work is a chance for us to increase our mastery at a certain skill and feel better and better over time about how well we know how to do something. There's There's a pride in being good at anything, like I was very proud that I could move 380 boxes in an hour. Like I felt like that was astounding, that I more than doubled the expected rate. That felt
Yeah.
amazing,
It's
and
about feeling
so,
useful, I guess. Yeah.
so I feel like, people often think, oh, if I were just free of this job, then everything would be awesome. But I do think that there's a lot to be said for thinking about work, not just as a mandatory thing that your life requires, but really trying to see the positives in it.
Yeah, that's a good lesson. Yeah, I think like you in that regard. Yeah, I think we complain too much sometimes, not only about work, about many things in our life, and then certain situations help us realize that maybe we're not that bad.
Right.
So, true.
If you were to like redesign so let's try to paint out the future of, let's say, work in a warehouse. How do you think it's gonna go in the next few years, and how would you like it to go? For example, for people to be a bit healthier, or maybe to make more friends. We're kind of curious of, after your experience, basically how would you design the future of this type of work?
Yeah, great question. I do not know anything about warehouse design, so a lot of this will be shooting from the hip, but I'll tell you a few things that strike me as potentially being helpful, especially for me as a software person, right? I tend to think of solutions where computing power might make things better. So let me give you some small examples. The job assignments are random in ShipDoc, right? They're semi-random, and the jobs work different muscles. So if you're working the flat packages, you're using your fingers a lot, you're sifting a lot of things an hour. If you're lifting the heavy boxes, you're using your thighs, you're using your back, right? I think one thing that would greatly improve the worker experience is simply having the algorithms basically shift you to using different muscles throughout the day. Instead of them just putting you in this one spot, and if no one talks to you, it's 11 hours, right? Just intentionally shift people. I think the other thing that could increase worker happiness with almost no cost to Amazon is simply either asking the employees once in a while which of the jobs they prefer, or dynamically just gauging based on their performance in each role, which roles they are naturally good at and they probably like more, right? And just assign people that way. I feel like both of these things would cost Amazon nothing, but would greatly improve the worker satisfaction. I do think, although I hope the unions at Amazon's, 2 or 3 factories are able to get those workers better protection and higher pay, I do think in the long run, that is a sort of dangerous and path to go down, in the sense that, every dollar per hour wage you raise in an Amazon warehouse just increases the benefit of robotization of removing that employee. When employees cost $18.55 an hour, the math is every month I cost Amazon about $2,800, right? And so in a year, something like $32,000. Now, let's suppose we have a machine that's a $50,000 machine, right? That could replace my work, right? Right now, it's not worthwhile to get that machine unless it lasts longer than a year, right? But at some point, if the union raises my wages to where that machine is well worth making, Amazon will roll in the machines. And the kicker that people might not understand is once that machine rolls in, a person never comes back. Like that is a permanent transition.
True.
And so even though Amazon right now is America's largest employer, I think there's a chance that Amazon might go down in history as America's largest employer ever, meaning like from this point on, it's quite possible that machines will be able to take over so many people's jobs that there will never again in America be an employer that employs 1 million people. So I do think that when I think about improvements to the worker condition, I also really worry about how much cheaper and better robots are getting, and that over time we have to acknowledge that people will probably be transitioned out of these jobs.
But that's very interesting. Like this robotization that is going to affect employment in the future, I'm pretty sure. Do you believe at some point some kind of universal income will be needed? I was reading a book recently. I don't know if you know the author. It's Yuval Noah Harari. It's called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century. And it's talking about that, the future need that we will have with robotization of universal income, because a lot of jobs will be lost. What's your view on that?
Yeah, I totally believe that, and here's the reason. And by the way, most of my tech friends in tech, don't believe this, right? They believe that I'm a Luddite, and in the past, whenever people have talked about jobs being replaced by machines, they've always been wrong, and that is true. Like if you look at the history of, for instance, the automation of agriculture, right? People said, well, what about all these farmers being put out of work, right? It turns out they just go get other jobs. So historically, it has not been true that people are permanently, kicked out of the job market. But I do think this time is different. And the reason I think this time is different is because in the past, when you kicked a farmer out of their job because you had a better tractor, right, there were so many other jobs in America that did not require a college degree. Like in the early 1900s, 4% of Americans had a college degree. So if you lost your job in 1925, 96% of jobs did not require a college degree. So it was very easy for you to get another job, right? These days, when automated trucks put truck drivers out of work, transportation is about 10% of American employment. Okay. So if you put truck drivers out of work, the question is, are there other jobs requiring similar entry-level requirements that they can go do? And I think increasingly the answer to that is no. If you look, like last year, Google announced that AlphaCode, their little AI, had been beating the majority of human competitors in online coding competitions.
Oh my God.
That is crazy, beating 60% of humans. And, that algorithm, they didn't even program it. They literally gave the algorithm the same text of the competition problem as the other humans. And so the algorithm had to first interpret the text and then figure out what the answer was and code the answer to submit the answer. It's absolutely crazy, right?
That's scary. That was my next question.
Right. It's super crazy. So why I think this time is different is because I believe algorithms are finally good enough that they can raise the floor of education or competency needed to hold any job. And so at this point, I do believe those jobs are going away. And then the question is, if a person cannot work, not because they're unwilling, right, but because they are unable to do the level of work that's required because computers can do all the entry level stuff, do they deserve to eat? Do they deserve to live in good health in America? And right now, America's answer is frankly no. America's answer is he who does not work shall not eat, right? It's basically America's answer. But at some point, when we recognize that even people who are willing to work can no longer fruitfully contribute to our capitalistic society, I think at that point, we really have to have a deep think as a collective. Do these people deserve to live? And if they do, how shall they? And I do think that universal basic income is one of the methods by which we express that sentiment that every human being has value. And in a society where robots are increasingly devaluing human labor, that doesn't mean the human's value overall goes to zero.
I think we're gonna see interesting times very, very, very soon. Yeah, I'm pretty sure that will happen, and we are gonna see it. Like millions of jobs are gonna go away.
Absolutely,
so it's interesting to see what they're gonna do.
Okay, let's see. I'm very curious, actually. So you went through the whole experience. Are you still back to engineering, or what you're doing at the moment, and what kind of exciting plans are there for you in the future?
Yeah, great question. I've been doing a few small jobs recently, and most recently I've transitioned to writing my own software. So I'm working on some software with a few former coworkers. But prior to that, I had been teaching at the University of Washington, as well as Northeastern University, teaching in the computer science departments, and working a few hours a week with the Gates Foundation, helping their education division with software-related decisions. So I'd been doing like a few small odd jobs, but no full-time jobs. Though now I've transitioned to wanting to write my own software full time.
Very cool. Super exciting. And these days, what motivates you?
Yeah, great question. I honestly find it still very difficult to figure out what I quote unquote should be doing with my life. When I was in my 20s and 30s, I was very ambitious for my career. And so when you're ambitious, I think career moves are very clear. You make whatever moves you think will grow your career. Now I am not ambitious for my career much. And so then the question is, well, what purpose, what things should I set my hand to? Since I don't technically need to work, the simple purpose of keeping everybody insured, in the family is also not a hardcore requirement for me. And so I am generating I'm trying to figure out what I can do that feels like it truly is contributing in some positive way to society, but also something that I enjoy and love doing. And so I've been playing more with software, trying to find the right domain of thing where I can feel engaged by it and I can feel that it will improve the world. So we'll see where that goes.
Nice.
Okay, I think we're gonna reach in the end of the program. I'm gonna ask you the final question. The other day we had a famous astronomer, Avi Loeb, in our program, and he had an inspiring life, inspiring as yours also, because we are learning a lot out of this conversation. And we asked him if he could tell us, like a lesson that he learned in life, and he could give us some advice. Like, what would be that lesson? If you had to say.
Interesting.
We can put a jingle in the meantime, but there's no pressure question. Anything comes to your mind, because we put you out of the spot. It's like when you ask about a joke, and it's hard to come up with something.
I guess there are a few. I'm just trying to think of what would be maybe helpful to someone else undergoing a similar situation. For me, I think one of the key lessons I took away, which goes back to one of Pedro's earlier questions to me, is that I had reached a point in my life, in my 30s, I was leading the Facebook London office. I was reporting directly to the CTO of Facebook. I was doing very well in my career and I was very busy. And I remember back then feeling constantly mildly annoyed at my family at times because I felt like I'm so busy at work. Please help me take care of these other things, but the kids needed stuff and I needed to help out, and I remember often feeling sort of short-tempered then. But, one of the most humbling things for me during my Amazon warehouse work was one day I was just eating my lunch, which my wife very graciously packed for me. And I opened this little container, and inside this little container were 3 chocolate pretzels. And for me, I almost started crying sort of in the break room because I knew that my wife packed those for me as an expression of her love for me, and I just reflected, back when I had quote unquote big, important jobs, I used to just be so annoyed at, the family for dragging me down and they were all this work. Right. And to think that, for me, having taken such a humble position and for her to love me the same, and to really support me through the same thing was just such a important, humbling thing for me to realize that the way that I had thought of my family was very uncharitable, when I was a bigwig somewhere, and to realize that I am the same person now, and she loves me the same, but I need to learn much better not to take for granted, the fact that the people in our lives who support us, they are every bit as important to our success. And so that's, I guess, my lesson.
That's very beautiful, Lexa. I was getting emotional.
Same. I was thinking about the chocolate pretzels and then tearing up. No, but honestly, amazing. I think that's very important, what you said, to all of us, because we all have those days when you just get a bit busy and a bit stressed out. And I think we bark the loudest at people that are the closest to us, which is a shame. But as you said, it's good to remind yourself that these people are there for you in the worst times, in the best times, and they love you. So it's good sometimes to be like, okay, it's not that bad. We can survive this. It's not worth being angry at everybody around. But yeah, I think it was a great lesson. Great lesson. A 10 out of 10. Okay, thank you, Philip. I think we need to close the podcast episodes already, but it was super interesting for us to hear your story. As I told you at the beginning, I think we both love your way of expressing and storytelling, very engaging. And we could imagine ourselves being in this warehouse with you and experiencing it alongside you. So thanks a lot. A massive pleasure to have you here.
Thank you.
Great. And thank you for having me. It was wonderful to have a chance to talk with both of you.
Yeah, same. It's a pleasure.
So thanks a lot.
So
Yeah, sure.
can I ask you two some questions? I just want to know.
Yeah, go for it.
Yeah,
Sure.
I'm super curious. Like, you've managed to land some really neat guests. I mean, the other people are all more prominent than I am, and I was wondering, how do you start off a podcast closing such interesting people? Like, do you just know a lot of people, or how's it work?
No, I
Uh,
basically I am very optimistic, and I try to contact many. Like the idea of the program is just to interview anyone. It doesn't have to be famous but someone who has something interesting to talk about. So obviously, I try to contact famous people sometimes, but any kind of people, and yeah, that's the way it works. So it's just a matter of statistics. Someone in the end is gonna accept.
So you
That's
do
why.
a lot of outreach, basically.
Yeah, I
we
think it's
can.
Pedro has the superpower of actually being, like very out there, optimistic person. And just as he said, basically the name of the podcast is an internal joke. Like we didn't know the name, so we call it just YOLO Podcast. And I think this YOLO kind of works in inviting guests a lot
Yeah.
because it's like if you're never gonna try it, actually don't know. And what we found is that there is a lot of people out there that really want to tell their stories or really share, and they're very passionate about what they're talking about. And I think that's what we are aiming for, to kind of try and fish those people that are really passionate and they don't care about don't know how famous are they gonna be or about the social media likes and statistic, but they
True.
really want to share something. And I think that's something that we welcome here a lot. And as Pedro said, it could be anyone. Like it could be our friend, or it could be an expert in AI, or it could be you who, I mean, I know you're a very humble person, but you also achieved a lot in your life and your story is super interesting. So I think it's this mentality of like, let's just try and let's see what's happened. And along the way, we can meet a lot of really interesting people. So that's why, but we don't know a lot of famous people.
Well, that's
So
really
no.
great that you've managed to like put together some really neat guests and whatnot. How are you advertising the podcast so far, and how has that gone? Because I find that there's so many podcasts out there right now, right? That
Yeah.
getting through the noise is actually a little tricky. Like, do you have a whole strategy behind that?
We
Well,
haven't yet.
we don't have a strategy and we don't advertise much. That's actually quite interesting too. We have Instagram
Yeah.
page, but for now we mostly relied on just having an interesting content. And then when we reach out to people, we of course add the link and stuff. And at the same time, we are trying to figure out like how to promote a little bit more so more people can actually listen because we barely started it as well. But yeah, I think there's a lot of things that we can learn now about the
Yeah.
advertisement of it and whatnot.
But
Sorry,
it's
Pedro, I
but
have
it's fair.
something to say too.
No, yeah, but it's fair to say that I know it's going to sound cliche and that, but we are not that interested in promoting anything. Although we're going to ask you if you can to promote it. But I
Yeah.
mean, it's just the joy of talking to people that has something interesting to say, because we are learning a lot, and it's really nice, even if no one knows you, and that's really, for me, it's fulfilling.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's really neat that the two of you have started. And I do think these shows work a lot better with two people, as the interviewers, because there's a little bit more banter and there's a little bit more that you can fit in than one person asking. So that's really cool. Well, I'm really excited that the two of you reached out. I appreciate you taking the time to chat with me today and to just explore some of these things together.
Same.
Yeah, very, very happy to hear that. And yeah, actually, a question from us, actually, because your story is super interesting. We saw some, we heard and saw some kind of interviews had with other people. Are you getting asked a lot about your story? Or
Yeah,
how was it for you?
not a whole lot because, my podcast Peak Salvation has a very small listenership. So at most maybe 1,000 or 1,200 people have heard it. So like it is not like a big thing, but I did have GeekWire in Seattle ask me because they cover tech in Seattle. And so Amazon's a big topic for them. And so I did go on GeekWire once or twice, which was fun. But in general, not many people have reached out because it's a pretty quiet quiet podcast, but I would be happy to chat with more people about it, because I think one of the biggest things that I was hoping to get the message out about is just how grossly unprotected American workers really are. Like I told the two of you, this idea that in America, when you lose your job, you lose your family's health care. That is like a massive thing. And this idea of people needing to find their own childcare in unpredictable schedules and just the inhumaneness of some of these jobs. This is what I was hoping we could start a conversation about. And to Pedro's point, I was really hoping we could also start a conversation around universal basic income, and this idea that I think if we don't plan for that, we're going to have increased unemployment over time and increased unrest. So I think it's super important for our society's balance, for everybody to get along and to really spread some of the wealth while we can.
Absolutely. I think you have a lot of important things to say. And as we discussed here as well, you shared a lot of lessons with us too. And I think because you have insight from kind of two extreme sides almost of the same kind of industry, that gives a great perspective of the overall kind of like work sphere and, people working on very, very kind of low paid, very hard demanding jobs, and people that work on quite important and very high paid jobs, but kind of struggling with different things, and also what's the future of both. So I think we covered a lot of really interesting things with you today. And we're very happy that you had time to spend with us.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks for being here.
And I hope you're going to enjoy listening to it, all the people that will. We enjoyed it a lot. And thank you, Philip, a lot. And have a nice day, because it's morning where you are at the moment.
Indeed. The both of you have a great evening.
Thank you. Goodbye.
When I'm running, I always take what I want and I always give it 100. Don't need a bank, no, I'm funded. Play the game like it's nothing. I'm always thankful for something. Don't take for granted, stay humble. Now wake up! It's time to look at the enemy. Look in the mirror if he is no friend to me. It's not working out, maybe